Hello and welcome to this interview series ahead of eCommerce Expo as part of Tech Week Singapore on the 9th and 10th of October at Marina Bay Sands. I'm Rebecca Uffindell, tech reporter at Techorati, and today my guest is Julie Fergerson, CEO at Merchant Risk Council. Julie will appear at eCommerce Expo in October, but today we will be talking about her life and what led her to speak at the show. So welcome to this interview series, Julie. What was your first event or year you would like to talk about?
Well, I'm excited to be here. So thank you for scheduling this interview. I think you asked a pretty hard question. What are some significant moments in my career? And when I reflect back, 1999, I had started my first company, and HP and Apple were customers, and Dell was a prospect. And I noticed that they had all of the same fraud concerns. And so we actually set up a lunch where the three of them could meet, and they were very nervous and uncomfortable. Oh, I'm meeting my competitor. I don't want to share those details. And something really incredible happened. They realized that the common enemy that they all faced was the e-commerce fraudster, and that by sharing what they were experiencing and how they were solving the problems, they were actually able to reduce fraud and stop some of the attacks. And so that is really how the Merchant Risk Council was born, was at that historic lunch where merchants started to share. And I always refer to that as the MRC magic. And while I had been in payments for a while, seeing that and seeing the collaboration and the passion has really inspired me throughout my entire career to educate, both personally and professionally, educate the world about fraud and payments.
Fantastic. And so what kind of kicked off that initial gathering of those big competitors? Was it an outreach you did, or was it more of pitching what the common, as you say, a common threat would be from that fraudster?
Actually, one of our brilliant data scientists on the team said, all these guys are talking to me about the same thing. We should pull them together. And so we picked up the phone and called and said, and did a little sales pitch to convince them to have lunch and meet each other, and they did. And really that's what happened. It was just one guy in the back of our room who noticed a commonality and said, hey, we should do this, and we made it happen.
With the fraudsters back then, what would you say is the biggest difference from now compared to back then? I'm guessing it's a bit of an evolution that's occurred, but is there something that's always kind of a singularity when we're talking about these fraudsters?
I think the common thread is they always have a lot more time, and they're very creative, and they're relentless. And so that was true almost 30 years ago, and it is certainly still true today.
That's really interesting. And so in this early days of e-commerce, how did you experience building this payment gateway and fraud prevention engine? And how did that kind of influence you tackling on fraud in much more global scale?
Yeah, so back in 1995, so we're talking a really long time ago, I had launched my first payment gateway. So that was my first company. And so I was so excited. The first merchant was going live, and I had a whole pipeline full of merchants. We flipped the switch on. I saw the first order come through. Great celebration. Then I saw the second order come through, and I was like, that looks a little bit suspicious. And so I started looking at it a little more, and I was like, that's fraud. That's like a crook trying to steal what this merchant is selling, which it was some software, some letter writing software. And we shut it down and hard coded in the rules. Hey, if it has these specific criteria, we need to block these kinds of transactions. And that's how the first fraud engine was born for e-commerce. In my world anyways, back in 1995. And I always refer to payments and fraud as breathing in and breathing out, but we truly saw so many payments start to come online. It was an easy way to shop. And what was really fun in the early days is we used to, on Friday nights, open a beer, grab a glass of wine, and sit in the server room and watch the fraudsters try to attempt to do e-commerce fraudulent purchases, because there was so little volume. You could watch it one at a time. And so there was a lot of manual review, but that's what us payment nerds did for fun back in the 90s.
That sounds really fun. It's almost like a viewing party to watch your kind of master plan at work. And yeah. I guess that kind of built a sense of community in what you were doing as well. And do you find that still continued on throughout the years, as building this sense of community and community-driven networks and team building?
Absolutely. In fact, one of MRC's statements or taglines is globally a community. And I really do believe that. One of the great things about the MRC is, we're a global nonprofit membership association, and any one of our members who's facing a challenge might say, hey, have you ever solved this? And pretty much guaranteed one of our other members has either solved it or is working on the same problem, and collaborating to solve those problems is really important, whether it is related to fraud or all these new emerging payment types. There's tokenization and 3D Secure, and every time you turn around, especially in APAC, there's thousands of local payment methods. So understanding the costs, the cross-border implications of all that stuff is really a challenge. And so there is never a dull moment in our industry.
I bet. And what is your kind of method for keeping on top of all this learning and keeping on top of all this different payment methods and for prevention? Is it kind of meeting up with similar members of your community, whether it be from high level or from the low level, people who experience it day to day? What is your kind of process in that?
I have three things that I really do. One is every morning I get up, between 4 and 5 a.m. and read the news. So what's going on in our industry, and there's a couple great news sources. The second is MRC. We have these things called community calls, and they happen about every 6 weeks. There's one on payments and there's one on fraud. And in these community calls, we really are talking about the latest and greatest of what's going on related to payments or related to fraud. And we actually have over 10 of these community calls. There's one for gaming, there's one for luxury goods, so all these different sectors. But if you sit in and listen, it's kind of like the canary in the coal mine of what is going on in our industry. And that is where I get the bleeding edge, what is happening, and truly how I stay up to date. And then the third is attending fantastic conferences all around the globe, talking to my peers, to our members, to non-members, just learning everything I can about the industry. And so that's one of the reasons I'm super excited about this upcoming conference.
And what is something that is a piece of advice perhaps for people who are within the industry that they need to keep a sharp eye on, or maybe like a learning you've learned over the years that has really shaped your understanding about the industry?
The thing I always encourage folks to do is ask. If you have a question, just ask. There isn't any formal official training in our industry of, hey, I want to go be a payments expert. We've built out a certification program at the MRC, and we've launched some education classes, and it's the start to a journey. Fast forward 20 years from now, I bet you'll be able to get a degree in payments. But now, while you're learning and trying to figure out, hey, what do I want to do and how do I learn? Just asking for help. People love to share what they've learned. And our industry is so inviting and encouraging. I just encourage everybody to ask.
And what was the kind of final year that you'd like to discuss with a big event or a year that shaped your life?
Back in 2020, my last company that I was at was acquired, and I had decided to take a break and possibly retire. Got quickly bored, and so started helping out the MRC. And while I'm one of the original founders of the MRC, I've actually had never been employed by the MRC. And they were looking for a CEO, and many of our board members encouraged me to apply. And so I applied for the job as MRC CEO and accepted it. And then the pandemic happened. So here I am joining an organization that hosts events around the world. And we're not going to have events around the world, but we were able to quickly pivot and really establish year-round engagement with our members and our community. And frankly, we became more vital to our members than ever, because e-commerce revenues just increased dramatically over the pandemic, and so did fraud, because the bad guys were also trapped at home and super bored. And so we hosted online webinars and virtual summits, and we were one of the first conferences to go back to in person. So we really chartered the way through that pandemic and came out, I will say, a better association for it. It brought us closer together as a community. But that taking on this role has materially changed my view of the world. I'm personally and professionally passionate about education and networking and advocacy work that we do around the world, and to be able to do it full time is just it's so um, inspiring. I am inspired by our members every day.
Wow, I mean, that sounds like such a fantastic but also quite frightening challenge to be part of that in through the pandemic. And obviously, with you were saying about putting on these events that can no longer go on, that was one of the main challenges. But were there any kind of other large challenges or smaller challenges that maybe you had not anticipated that you had to overcome during this time?
People forgot how to talk to each other when we got back to in person. And
Mm.
so it was really awkward, and you didn't know, do you hug? Do you shake hands? Do you stay the 6 feet away? So coming up with social cues. And then, when we all got back, instead of saying, hey, what's new in payments? I think the first question was, which vaccine did you get, or did you get vaccinated, right? So redirecting the conversations back to what was normal was a very surprising challenge. It was almost uncomfortable. Everybody was so excited to get back to in person, but we were all a little scared and like, how's this going to work? So that journey back to the new norm. And I will say the new norm is very different than pre-pandemic. One of the biggest things that I've seen is before the pandemic, our members would have their conference plan for the year. They'd be booking, registering for our events months before. So we had a really good idea of who's coming. And post-pandemic, and it's not unique to the MRC, people register like 3 weeks before an event. We see our registration almost double. And so watching that as a event planning is one of our key things we do. That took a little bit of getting used to. Like, is anybody going to show up? It's like when you're having a party at your house, everybody RSVP'd, but you don't know if somebody's going to show up. It was that feeling for a couple of years. Now we're all kind of used to it, and we have our models adjusted to reflect that. But that's been a surprise and a challenge.
Yeah, I think there's been lots of things like that where it's just that level of uncertainty now. Everyone's kind of on the back foot about a lot of things because the future doesn't seem as guaranteed anymore. But speaking of the future, what do you anticipate with changes with a payment protection or with fraud or any kind of events planning? What do you think is on the horizon for us?
I think the biggest change that we're going to see in the next decade is payments are becoming a materially important position within companies. So anybody who's in retail, I've seen over the last couple of years the role of a chief payments officer or a chief commerce officer and having a seat at that strategic table at companies. And I think a part of it is the regulators are now chiming in and creating tons of new rules across the globe. And so if you sell things online, you can't just know what the rules are in your region. You actually have to know them globally. And so it's become a complex and very big job. And that's how you get paid, right? That's the money. And, e-commerce steadily is taking over the card present volume. It's still much smaller than card present. But I believe we're seeing the shift of card not present being in the store now. So whether you're checking out with a kiosk or, you're tapping and paying or, you're checking out with an app. Like I went to a store the other day and I was scanning my items with my app and I pushed pay and walked out. So that's now all of a sudden a card not present transaction. So the omni-channel that we've been talking about for the last 20 years really has already happened. We just didn't necessarily notice it. And so I think that's a big change that we're going to see in the next 10 years.
What is something that you'd like to tell our audiences before your speaking sessions at eCommerce Expo?
Please come by and say hi, right? And introduce yourself. I love meeting new people and hearing what people are thinking about. And so I just want to say, I am open. Come say hello.
Just ask. Lovely. Well, thank you so much for speaking to me today. I can't wait to see what you have on offer for us at eCommerce Expo as part of Tech Week Singapore. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.